Again, yeah, thank you, Zoom, for the recording in progress. We're really excited today to have Becca Layton, Bill Lindstadt, and Kim Petri here to speak about their experiences applying for competitive grant opportunities from the NSF, NIH, Burroughs-Wellcome Fund, and more. Today's session is meant to be a more low-key or open-ended Q&A panel with our fabulous panelists, so please enter your questions into the chat to help organize the panel. So again, just a little bit of an overview. We have some opening remarks about the GCC in case you're new to the organization, a full open Q&A session with our panelists, and then some concluding announcements of how to stay in touch with the GCC about upcoming events. So as a reminder, our Graduate Career Consortium is an international organization comprised of higher ed professionals leading career and professional development for grad students and postdoc trainees. We've been around over 30 years, since 1987. And our mission too is to lead the advancement of grad level career and professional development programs, as well as to engage and nurture our unique nexus of expertise, knowledge, resources, and people in the graduate career and professional development community. And so within that, our professional development committee was recently launched in the past year with the mission of supplementing existing professional development opportunities for GCC members. Again, recently launched last year, our committee's mission has been to develop a competency-based framework, again, to highlight the diverse and unique competencies of our growing profession. Our major programs include a survey of competencies, an ongoing project, as well as this webinar series meant to supplement the many opportunities for members to showcase, as well as to develop new skills. Some other recent webinar topics include engaging with our micro-credentials community of practice, as well as other sessions on working with humanities majors, among others. I'd like to extend a big thanks to Pallavi Eshwara, our outgoing committee co-chair, for starting us off on a high note this year with a series of grant workshops. Today's session is part 2, following up on a grants workshop session we had in late July, focusing on ways to communicate with university funding and research offices. We're also looking forward in October to a part 3, looking at the perspective of funding agency perspectives. So I'm happy to introduce our main panelists, and in a minute, they'll be explaining a little bit more about their role in graduate career professional development and their pathway to becoming successful grant winners. So first of all, a big warm welcome to Becca Layton at UNC Chapel Hill, down the road from my home university of NC State. Becca is the Director of Professional Development Programs. And welcome to Bill Lindstadt, Assistant Vice Chancellor for Career Advancement, International and Postdoctoral Services at UC San Francisco. And welcome as well to Kim Petri, Assistant Dean for Biomedical Career Development and Associate Professor of Medical Education at the Vanderbilt Medical School. So again, we want you all to get the most out of this session and our panelists' wisdom in applying for grants and other competitive funding applications. So this will be an open-ended Q&A panel, but Amy and I have some questions to get our panelists started. So I'd like our panelists to first introduce themselves more in the order that you see on the screen and really explain a little bit more about how you came to apply for grants. For example, was this part of a mandate in your department? Did you collaborate with faculty members? And then we'll delve into some deeper specifics on getting the most out of grant applications.
Hey, thanks, Katie. So the first question of kind of how did I encounter grants is I began as a program director for NIH BEST. I came in after it was submitted by my predecessor, so I didn't get to see that process. But when I came in, I was able to participate in leadership meetings, as well as data gathering, as well as annual meetings through the NIH BEST Consortium. And so this gave me a really good overview about how grants worked and got me thinking more about doing grants on my own. Then a second opportunity arose related to, but indirectly through NIH BEST, an NIH Best Bet cohort that decided to apply for a sub-grant led by Boston University. And so I opted in to participate in that group, and advocated to be a sub-awardee. So I had the opportunity to actually go through the application process as a sub-awardee for the first time, which is a tiny bite-sized version of doing a full grant. And so I also applied for a BWF career development grant, which I did not get. So you won't get everything you applied for, but it's good to get the experience. And then finally, most recently applied for and was awarded my first RO1 from NIH, NIGMS. So that was really exciting. And that has been my experience to date. So I will pass it on to Bill.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to participate. I guess I got started writing grants with very small projects through private foundations. I worked at an engineering college in Indiana, Rose-Hulman Institute, and one of our board members was also on the board of the Kauffman Foundation, which is like an entrepreneurship foundation in Kansas City. And he had the idea to, he pitched an idea to our president, who then sent it to me in the career office to start an entrepreneurial internship program. And we kind of started with a pilot grant, which is something we might talk about later. But then it grew into a much larger grant and sort of a national program. And so that was sort of my first introduction to, oh, you can get other people to pay for cool ideas that you want to do in your office instead of trying to like get your boss to pay for them. And so that sort of moved into some other private funding opportunities through like the Lilly Endowment. And then I've also worked with the Burroughs-Wellcome Fund on a couple grants and the Moore Foundation. So a number of private foundations that seem like they have much less transparent ways of getting funding. And so maybe that's something we can talk about, is a lot of different ways into private foundations that aren't necessarily as well publicized as you see from like NSF or NIH. So that's kind of my introduction.
Okay. I'm Kim Petri. I'm Assistant Dean for Biomedical Career Development at Vanderbilt, and thank you all for the invitation to be part of this and terrific program. I'm so glad to see the GCC hosting things like this and getting the word out about opportunities for, I think, our members to get funding for the terrific work that we all are doing at our institutions. So really grateful to the GCC for hosting this. My very first experience with grant writing was as a graduate student. I had a NIH National Research Service Award grant, and but in a career development context, my very first opportunity to apply for a grant came when the Burroughs-Wellcome Fund issued their career guidance for trainees program, which I think was now way back in 2012. And so I put together a small proposal for that, which ultimately that first one was not funded, but wound up using some of the pieces that we had proposed for that grant in our best grant, which came up, I think we wrote just a couple of months later. And so one of the sort of lessons learned, if I allude to it, is even the things that don't get funded, we find a way to use in the future. So it's a helpful process, even if something doesn't ultimately get funded. Then in 2012, we wrote a best grant in collaboration with 2 tenured faculty members here, and I was a PI on that. And then we had career guidance for trainee awards from the Burroughs-Wellcome Fund in 2015 and 2018. And I helped co-write both of those, as well as in 2018, a supplement to a T32 training grant from the National Institute of General Medical Sciences, or NIGMS. And so that was another opportunity to collaborate with some existing training programs at Vanderbilt to enhance professional development for our graduate students in particular. So that's one that is available if you happen to have those institutional training grants from the NIH at your institutions. That may be a good place to partner with some faculty to get involved with those and open up some doors there. As in addition to all of those, I've been involved in writing a couple of smaller foundation grants over the years that did not get funded from, I think, Genentech Foundation, Procter & Gamble, and I've served as a reviewer for NSF as well. So that's my kind of grant writing background.
I'm gonna jump in. Sorry if I'm breaking the order, but Kim, I loved your point about stuff that doesn't get funded. Make sure it gets used. It's so important. One of the ones that was not funded for me, we were able to move forward with unfunded because I had just gotten enough letters of support that people were excited about it, and so we did it anyway without money. And so I just want to really reiterate that either repurpose it or use it for a jumping off point. So important. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Becca. And thanks again to all of our panelists. I think building on what you all said, can you all explain a little bit more about some of the funding agencies you're involved in? Kim and Becca, you both mentioned NIH BEST or BET grants, and Bill too, you talked about the importance of small foundations. So I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to share one relevant funding agency related to career development and just explain a little bit more about the acronyms and the size of the foundation.
Sure. So I'll start with NIH, National Institutes of Health. There are many institutes, I think 27 if I have the current number to date. And so finding the right one can be challenging. For those who are in biomedical sciences, this is a really attractive opportunity, especially if you're in a school of medicine. It's well recognized. Often if you have existing funding sources, it's easier to build upon that and get more. As Kim mentioned, T32 supplements are great. We participate in one of those too. And so it helps build if you have any of those existing grants at your institution. NIH Broadening Experiences in Scientific Training, or BEST, is the one that a couple of us have mentioned. And then my current grant is actually a collaboration between NIH, NIGMS, and NSF, SBE, which is Society, Social Behavioral Economic. And so my office internally calls it the unicorn grant because I was like, oh my God, they wrote it for me. But it's this really weird combination. So always be on the lookout for weird combinations that really speak to what you're doing, because there might be one out there. And so I think I'll hand it off with that.
Let's jump in. Also, I don't know if I'm going to go off the assignment, sorry, and say and piggyback on what Becca was saying, is that like for NIH, it seems like a lot of the grants that I've seen that have any kind of a career development focus come through NIGMS, which is sort of the general fund, or the director's fund. And of the 27 institutes, I'm sure they have like training grant supplements that are through the institute. But the training grant supplement seems fairly easy and short if you're thinking about fun, and is usually in the is it $85,000 range? Is that?
Yeah, I think it's like 80K, and yeah. It's so much better than a full application. I mean, you can put it together in maybe a few weeks or a month instead of 6 months. So it's a big bang for your buck if you can put one together.
And great way to I think we just got one at UCSF. I'm not associated with it, but it's going to pay for a good chunk of someone's salary for a year. And you can kind of use the money for, a variety of different things, but it's just a great way to partner with faculty where they get to see the value of what we're doing, and we get some pretty easy money out of it. So I strongly recommend the T32 supplement route. I think rather than speak about one private foundation, maybe what I would say in terms of working with private foundations is that it's the importance of the program officer and thinking creatively about the foundation's stated funding priorities. So you could go on the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation is a couple $2 billion foundation, I think, in the Bay Area that's given us 2 grants. And if you look at their funding priorities, they don't actually say they fund career development, but for the grants that we've gotten from them, it's been an introduction from a faculty member to a program officer who's generally interested in science education, and then you can spin what we spun what we wanted to do, which was develop an internship program for graduate students. We spun that into we figured out how to make that a pitch that's also promoting science education, and got a pilot grant, and then that person really liked it and ended up funding the larger grant for us. And so the suggestion I would make for working with private foundations is just thinking broadly about how their funding priorities might match what you want to do, and then starting to work directly with the program officer. Kim.
Yeah, I was going to just add to that, if you are working within an existing program that you are applying to, like, for example, the Burroughs-Wellcome Fund, Career Guidance for Trainees Award, or any of the program announcements, like through the NSF, through the NIH, in addition to reaching out to the program officer, just taking the time to really read through the full program announcement and understand what the objectives are, and making sure that you're tailoring your program and you have an idea that is responsive to what they are looking to fund is really a critical piece of the process. And I stuck a question that was in the chat, was about how do you find out who at your institution has T32s? And I stuck in the chat a link to the NIH report database, which you can search by funding mechanism type. So you would search for T32 and your institution name, and it would pull a list of the existing grants at your office. And as Bill said, I think NIGMS, a lot of the T32 supplement type things that I've seen around career or professional development have been through NIGMS specifically. So you might want to concentrate on those faculty directors who have grants with the General Medical Sciences Institute in particular.
And I know we're supposed to only do one, but I think we would be remiss if we don't also mention NSF, which funds a lot of different opportunities like IPERT, IPERT. There's another one that I'm not thinking of right now.
NRT.
NRT.
Yeah, and so there's other ones as well, but a number of great opportunities through NSF, National Science Foundation. And then AAMC, great, or not great, but AAMC also has some career development ones, and Burroughs-Wellcome Fund, as I think Kim mentioned about the Career Guidance Award. So I don't know if we can pepper in any other ones we're missing, Kim or Bill, but just to give people some places to start maybe.
Yeah.
And I think, depending on the nature of what your idea is, I would reach out to like your foundation relations office, or look for, if your institution has a institutional subscription to databases of funding opportunities, using those can help you maybe find those funding opportunities in niche areas. If you are looking to get something really specific funded, then that's a great place to look for those kinds of things that may not be well known.
Another thought about NSF is it seems much less easy to understand how they're structured and how their grant programs are structured than NIH, to me at least. But there's a great opportunity for everyone on this call to attend part 3 of this, because NSF program officer Mark Letty, who's super excited about working with all of us, is going to be on the panel. And I think that would be a really important question for us to ask him, is can you tell us how your place works? Because there's different directorates and different funding mechanisms within the directorates, and sometimes they work together and you have to get one on board before you get the other on board. It's just a little bit mysterious, but once you figure it out, there's actually a lot of opportunities there. Also, there was a question about, if you work with private foundations, do you have to work with your advancement office? Kim mentioned that your foundation relations or corporate foundation relations office might be useful. But I think it probably depends on your university, your institution. Like at UCSF, when I worked at a private engineering college, a $50,000 grant, we partnered, our foundation relations office helped us write it. Whereas at UCSF, they'd be like, that's not worth my time. So I think they wouldn't really care. And we don't tell our advancement office what we're not required to tell them. And it's not that they wouldn't be helpful, they just have bigger fish to fry than $50,000 grants, which doesn't seem like small money to us, but I guess is to them.
Yeah, one other thing to mention that just piggybacking off of what Kim and Bill mentioned, other offices on campus that can help are offices of strategic, Office of Sponsor Research, OSR, and Office of, there's another one, Research Development, Offices of Research Development. And they can actually help you identify opportunities, write your grants, help you connect with other PIs. And if you happen to be at a place that has a major center, sometimes centers will also help connect you. So I'm thinking of like NIH centers, like we have a translational medicine track and NC Tracks Institute. And I think a couple of other folks I see on the call are at places that have those too. So those can be really good places to find connections of other people who want to do related work, and it might not be someone you've worked with before.
Awesome. Thanks to all of our panelists for those great answers. And thanks, Bill, too, for plugging our upcoming Part 3 series, which really looks at funding agencies' perspectives. And for all you, keep your questions coming in the chat. We'll get to them in a few minutes. I'd just like to ask all of our panelists some questions more about the process of applying for grants, as many of our members may have these questions. So like most of us, we are very busy. We wear many hats in our roles with graduate career and professional development. So can you explain a little bit more about like how much time you spent searching for, developing grant applications, getting feedback on them, and a little bit more too on the ROI of the process? So how much time would we need to set aside from all other parts of our jobs to write and manage grants? And likewise, drawing on specific experiences, was it worth applying, and some general like lessons learned from the process of applying or managing a grant?
Oh, that's tall order. I'll try to remember all of those. All right. So first of all, how much time to set aside? For me, when I started writing, I think the key was having support of my supervisor. And so once I had that, it was sort of like green light, like take the time that you need to. And then I just had to carve it out of my schedule. With a range of like how much time does it take versus how much time once you get it does it take. I would say I probably started thinking about applying about a year out, put it on my long range calendar, started meeting with people and talking about it, maybe started writing or pulling things together in earnest or meeting with offices maybe like 6 months out. And then, really the last 3 months, 2 months, month, I mean, just block out a lot of time. It's going to be like all consuming for a little while. So if you can time, like for me, I timed my writing to be mostly over the summer for my R01 submission, because I knew I was going to just need to carve out huge chunks. And so it was before the fall semester hit, and it was due in September. And so that worked out well for my schedule. And I missed a grant cycle because I really wanted to apply for the May one. So I was all psyched up and spent all of the spring thinking about writing it. And then I was just like, there's just no way. And so then I had the summer to actually write it. So give yourself some grace, but also give yourself a good amount of time. For some of the smaller grants, I think you could do a little bit less time than that. Like probably a month or 6 weeks is completely reasonable to pull things together. But you want to have time to meet with people and get letters of support and get people on board. So you kind of want to have a pretty good nugget of an idea, or at least a write-up that you can share with people about where you're planning to go with it, even if it's not all the way written, pretty early in the process, so that you can pass that around to get people on board and get support. As far as amount of time, the lowest amount that I had proposed during the grant was like 1%, which I spent way more than that, but that's like what the allowable salary component was. And I think the largest ones are around 20 or 25%, where that's the cap of the amount of time you can spend. In reality, I think if you're doing a large grant, probably 10 to 20% is realistic of your time, and it's going to fluctuate. Some weeks you might spend 5% of your time, and other weeks you might spend 50% of your time, but it will vary a bit. Go ahead, Bill. I'll stop.
No, I was gonna interrupt you with a question. You're talking about the amount of time that you ultimately you pay for, the amount of your time that you ultimately pay for from the grant.
Yeah, and thinking about how much
I think you're also saying that.
Yeah,
you're also saying that it takes a lot of time to write the grant, right? Which you can't charge to the grant.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
And hence it's important to get your supervisor on board before you start writing, to make sure that they're excited about this. Because, the expectation is you're not going to get everyone that you write for, and hopefully be able to repurpose it, but you've really got to get the support of your office that they're on board and excited about this. And then you kind of have more freedom to spend your time as needed to get it done, I think. And maybe I'll pause because I know that was a lot of questions, and we can kind of keep going with the other parts.
I interrupted you, and then I forgot what the questions were.
The first part was how much time did you spend writing it?
Oh, yeah.
And, what went into that part?
So, I mean, at UCSF, we got a best grant also. I think they were awarded in 2012. We started writing a few months early because I think the request for proposals only came out like 3 or 4 months before the deadline. So this was an NIH grant that probably was more than 100 pages. I can't even remember now. And we had like 40 letters of support. And it took a team of 4 co-PIs, probably half our time during some weeks in the couple of months that we were trying to put that whole thing together. So, but that was also a very, very large grant program for a couple $1 million. And it seems like the amount of time and the length of the grant proposal are sort of directly proportional to the amount of money you're asking for. And so we've spent a couple of weeks, probably less than 40 hours total writing, a Burroughs-Wellcome CGT grant, the Career Guidance for Trainees grant, which I think is like up to $50,000. And a relatively simple proposal, a few pages and a budget, and I think some letters of support. So it kind of varies in how much time I spent writing grant proposals. When I was at the private college in Indiana, there was a large grant that probably had 50 people writing different sections of it that was to a private foundation. And that took probably less than 10 hours per person, but the person who was coordinating it probably took all of their time for a couple months prior. So it just kind of really varies on the type of mechanism you're trying to get funded. Is it worth it? Yeah, absolutely. I would say just for the main reason that everybody else has said is even if you don't get funded, we've like, oh, this is a great idea. Let's find a way to do it anyway, or let's go ask our boss for a little bit of money since we didn't get it from external sources, and been able to, initiate the program that we wanted to get funded. And it's a bummer when you get that letter that says you didn't get the money, but you pick yourself up and did our best to try to get the project done anyway.
And that one of the Career Guidance for Trainees awards, just as an example, one of the Career Guidance for Trainee Award applications that we wrote in 2016 that didn't get funded, we turned around, I think, a year later and took a small piece of it and applied for a P&G grant, and were able to, tweak our application, pull out the parts we needed, and do that in like a half a day. And it was a couple $1,000s, allowed us to do enhancements to a small program. And then we took other pieces of it and we turned it into our T32 supplement that we did in 2018. So we definitely, even though there was a lot of time on the front end and it wound up not paying off, we definitely repurposed it and managed to get our time out of it for sure.
Yeah, and I'll just also add that for freedom of time, I think there's a value in this too. So Bill mentioned being able to move forward with projects you want, or having the ability to then ask for funds if you didn't get it because you've kind of worked really hard to put it together. But I'll say that I also think that it gives us more freedom in other parts of our budget, because when I have been able to, if I wanted to do something autonomously a bit different that I maybe would have to like reach to ask for, but it's somewhere within the realm of the grant, I can just tell my office, hey, I'm doing this, it's part of the grant. And so that's been a huge benefit, where they've kind of given me the autonomy to say, okay, you worked hard to get this, now, do what you think is good with this. And so that's been I think an indirect benefit that I've really enjoyed.
Kim just mentioned something that I hadn't really thought of before too, which is you mentioned the P&G grant for a few $1,000s. It seems like a lot of big corporations have their corporate foundations that aren't going to fund, $1 million grant or a $50,000 grant, but in the $5,000 to $10,000 range to do a program or an event. And those are usually pretty easy, not easy. No grant is proposal is easy to write, but not super burdensome. And just a question for Kim, like the only corporate grants we've gotten have been like because some alumni person knew someone else that could get us an entree to that foundation. Is that what you found too?
So we've applied for a Genentech Foundation and did not get it, and we don't have a connection there. And P&G, I think it was really small, but I want to say somebody in our foundation relations office alerted us to that. So I don't know if that wound up playing a role in us getting it in any way, but yes, I'm sure those personal connections do help with those things.
That was my small experience in that area, was just the same thing. The amount of money you get is directly proportional to how hard it is to write the grant. And so it's a couple pages and you get $5,000 or $10,000, and that's totally worth it.
Yep. And I guess the other piece to pay attention to on any of these, though, is like, what can you use this grant for? For example, that P&G grant, we couldn't actually pay people with that. And so that's just something to be aware of when you're looking at these opportunities. What can you actually use the funds for? Because if you've got a pot of money, but nobody to carry out the project, sometimes it's a little finicky, like you can't pay a consultant fee, but you could pay their travel. So you just be aware that sometimes these things have some nuances to what you can spend money on.
Yeah, that also brought to mind that you can look internally for grants too. And especially for small grants, like I know our NC Tracks, for instance, I mentioned earlier, tries to promote collaborations and innovative ideas. They have like every month they have a 2K grant that's primarily used for science stuff, but you could apply for something like that. Our graduate school had like I think it was like a 10 or 15K grant for a innovative course development or something, right? So, you know, you can gather colleagues from across the campus, gain some traction by having a small group and a team, and apply for any of those too. And those make you more likely to get those. And especially if you're kind of a little intimidated by applying externally, if you start with something small or internal, that can be a nice way to dip your toe in if that feels like less scary.
Yeah, thanks again to all of our panelists. These responses and tips are really insightful. We have a great question in the chat though from Katie M about, have any of you had difficulties of being the PI on the grant versus needing a faculty co-sponsor as a PI? So if like our panelists can jump in and speak to that, like how did you negotiate that, particularly working with a faculty member?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So first, when I first started doing grant writing, I kind of did the writing and didn't think too much about that. And as I did more of it, I started to advocate and say, I really want to be the PI. I want to be the contact PI. How can I make that possible? And so that is tricky. There are some types of grants where there are either restrictions internally at your institution or by the granting institution. So I actually had those conversations with the program officers and said, are there any restrictions? Can I be the contact PI? And if so, do you see any unofficial downsides to it? Is that going to hurt our application in any way? And so ultimately I was able to be a SubAward contact PI and an R01 contact PI for the grants that I submitted. But I think that was somewhat unusual, and I did have to have active conversations both with my leadership team to make sure they were on board with that, as well as with the program officers to make sure there wouldn't be any conflicts.
At UCSF, and I think this is true, I see a few other UC people on here, I think this is true across the UC system, there's a PI waiver process that if you're not a faculty member or not sort of designated from a HR class that allows you to write grants, you can get a waiver. And it turns out it just has to be signed off by like a vice chancellor level person or a dean level person. And so, most departments want us to get money. And so it feels like our mercenary universities are going to be like, if there's a way to get money into the university and help staff do what they want, then we'll find a way to let you do that. So I don't know if there's other stories. I'm sure there's different versions of the same story as we sort of look at the different universities represented here. But I bet there's a way, even if you're first told, well, staff members don't really write grants here, I bet there's a way to get around it if you really start digging. And which was actually the case for me when I first started at UCSF. I was told that, and it turned out it wasn't that I wasn't allowed to be a PI on a grant. It was that there's another question in the chat box. It was that we didn't have the structure in our unit to support the management of the grant once we got it. So at most big universities, there's a pre-award department and a post-award department. So in your Office of Sponsor Research, you have people that work on the grant writing and helping you as a PI get the grant over the finish line and into the funding agencies to get the proposal in there on time. And then there's the people who manage the grant money afterwards. And we didn't have sufficient support for the post-award piece, which is a lot of, like, especially on a federal grant, a lot of following the rules and understanding how, you know, federal accounting principles work and doing the reporting, and it's pretty onerous. And so that's been a bigger issue, which we can say more about later, perhaps.
I don't really have anything to necessarily add. I have a faculty appointment, so it's not something I've had to grapple with, but I will say that using the best awards as an example, which was a very unique type of grant. But I think that the institutions that really stand out to me among the institutions that had those were actually partnerships between the faculty who were training students and postdocs and kind of career offices, and that those seem to be really the standout institutions that had that synergy between the training programs and the career and professional development people. So I would seek out those partnerships, even if it may not be something that you need. I think seeking out that collaboration with faculty, if you have the opportunity to do that, will only enhance your program.
And Kim, I don't know if this is too off topic, so feel free to defer if so, but did you always have that faculty title? Or if not, how were you able to get that so that you were able to not have to navigate some of those barriers?
Yeah, it might be a little just unique to my situation, my institution. So I'm in a dean's office and was able to get that way back in 2009 before we ever considered, applying for grants. So it wasn't something that I sought at the time that we did the grant. So it's probably not very broadly relevant to most people, I don't think.
Thanks. I was curious about that.
I would say, though, that like at UCSF, where our unit reports to student affairs and we're all staff, our primary appointments are as staff members, we still, for those folks with PhDs who want faculty appointments, we've been able to get like adjunct faculty appointments for them. And I think it's made a difference for their careers as well as their ability to sort of smooth out the grant writing process and get the support of our pre-award department. So for those of us who have PhDs, for those of you who have PhDs, if there's a way to get a faculty appointment, I think it can help your credibility probably with a lot of funding agencies. So I would pursue that if you can. Another thing, sorry, not to just sort of riff on what everybody else was saying, but Kim mentioned the best awards and how a lot of the ones that sort of, I guess, were quite productive were those which had teams of PIs that were faculty and career development folks also. And I just remember going to the first best meeting where I think maybe there were 10 institutions represented, and looking around the room, and I was like, I think I'm the only staff person here, which was not true totally, but it was mostly, it seemed like it was a lot of teams of all faculty members. And I think we've come a long way in our field in the last 10 years to have our faculty wanting to work with us and vice versa. So just a side comment.
And I'll jump in with one more tag team, which is writing in leadership teams is key. So even if you're writing on your own, like make a multi-investigator leadership team, involve faculty, whether or not you're the contact PI, because they're going to know the ins and outs. They're going to be able to mentor you on the particular grant type, whether it's NSF or NIH or other types they've done. It's just going to be so much to your benefit. So I would say have a team.
Awesome. Thanks, Becca, Bill, and Kim, for your insights. Your responses to and echo Teresa's question in the chat too about grant writing teams. And so could our panelists just briefly say a little bit more about the strengths you're looking for in members of a grant writing team? So not just like titles like faculty and deans, but what specific strengths might you be looking for in assembling a grant writing team, since after all, grants is a team sport.
I don't know if we want to keep doing the order or just bounce around. So I think just trying to get a broad array of experiences. So if you're a staff member trying to get faculty, if you are social behavioral scientists, get some biomedical scientists. If you are early career, get some late career, right? Like whatever sorts of diversity of opinion you can get on there. Getting diverse identities, right? Like having people from underrepresented minorities, having men and women, just having international folks, like anybody that you can get that has different perspectives from yours. And if you can't get them all on the leadership team, get an advisory board and have the advisory board convene while you're writing so you can get their perspectives on the draft. And then a bunch of those people can be your letter writers and supporters when you're submitting. And then later when you're actually implementing the grant, they can also be the advisory board as you move forward to be a sounding board.
I'll take maybe a little different tack on the responses. Depending on, regardless of who's on your team, as you're writing the proposal, this isn't my advice. This came from a faculty member at UCSF who's written lots of grants for science as well as other things. And the advice was stage your writing process so that you can collect information, you can collect advice from, what I guess could serve as sort of an advisory team pre-grant. So as you're writing the grant 6 months before your proposal date, just write down a couple of bullet points about the ideas that you're trying to write, that you want to get funded, and just have some very free-ranging conversations with people who you respect in your institution, outside of your institution, faculty members, other staff, and get lots of feedback on the ideas. And don't worry about the structure of the grant or perhaps even the mechanism that you're writing for, because you can just get lots of advice about that. And then start to narrow it down with different people who you respect and who could give you advice about the writing process. So I guess the advice was shop around your ideas a lot before you actually start writing, and just sort of hone in those, and then decide what kind of grant you're going to write for, and start getting advice about how to fit your ideas to the requirements of that grant. And that's when you would want to bring in a program officer for that grant mechanism and get advice from them about, here's an idea that I'm trying to propose. Does it fit your funding priorities? Is it the wrong, are you the wrong target program? Are there other programs you could refer me to if it's not going to be a fit? And then start getting feedback on the writing. And it seems like that is backwards from how some people approach it, which is, I'm going to get 3/4 of the way through the process and then start getting feedback from advisors. So I think the team answer to the question would be, engage, even if they're informal team members, engage them really early in the whole writing process.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add, those are both terrific comments. And the only thing I would add is having been a reviewer for a large grant program, that the larger the grant, the more important it is to show kind of institutional buy-in and support from your leadership. And, it's probably not as critical on those smaller grants, but on the larger grants, it's, if there isn't institutional support there, if the people applying haven't gotten what appears to be the buy-in of their institutional leaders, it can kind of come through. So the larger the grant, the earlier to start talking with those key people to get their enthusiasm and excitement about what you're proposing to do.
Yeah, great idea.
Yeah, great. Thanks y'all for sharing. And everyone, keep your questions coming in the chat. As our timeline's down though, there's also a question. Amy has a question about do you all have any experience with multi-institutional grants, specifically the NSF Science and Technology Center grant?
So the SubAward grant that I alluded to was an NSF includes grant. So it was not the science and technology grant, but I think having a lead institution who's going to do the submitting and coordinating and kind of be the hub is really important. I don't know. I guess you could do a pair of lead institutions or something, but it seems to me that having one single lead institution is probably the best way to go. And then having everyone else doing sub-awards if they are going to do that, or just being administered through the primary team that's going to be coordinating. That just allows it to be much more streamlined so that you may have a lot of ideas, but somebody's got to actually corral them and write it. And so it gives it a little bit more organization.
Can I ask a follow-up, Becca? Can you just explain the sub-award process and how that all works a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So the group originally convened at NIH Best and sort of did an open call as anyone interested in writing to focus on undergraduate, underrepresented minority exposure and career development in science. So getting sort of pipeline mechanisms and getting earlier interest that will eventually trickle into NIH Best sort of graduate training. And so a group of institutions elected to collaborate and do that. And so that group met separately to develop the idea, exchanged emails, had monthly calls and things like that to write the grant itself. And then once we proposed the budget, there was some discussion over which institutions wanted to take which sized bites of different things. And so for those institutions that wanted a little bit of a bigger bite, sometimes a sub-award made more sense when they would be like, we funded travel to and from our institution for some of our partner institutions for undergraduates who came from UPR in Puerto Rico, and some that were local. And so we like purchased the bus to, paid for the rental bus to bring people back and forth. And so rather than applying to our parent awardee every time we needed reimbursements, we administered a subsection of the grant from our institution. And so a sub award, and for some of the institutions, they were only doing like a small program. So it was easier for them to have the parent grant just implement it, and then they would just reimburse it. So there's different ways to go about that. And you just have to think about for your particular budget, what makes sense. And the sub award is basically you take the big award and then you just write the sections that just apply to your university. So like the institutional portions and kind of the specific budget for your portion and some other sub pieces, but you don't have to do the whole grant, just the portions that are directly relevant for your piece of the grant. Bill, I think you're on mute.
I don't have experience with the science and technology centers specifically in terms of writing for those, but I think NSF seems like they have lots of multi-institutional opportunities and lots of, and it seems more common than NIH, at least in my experience, to have sub-awards. We're in my office, we have Nalidi Saul is a PI on a pretty large NSF grant with a city college in San Francisco, CCSF, and the grant, to my earlier point, that there's like all kinds of grant opportunities out there that you might not think of as career development grants, but this is it's called Advanced Technology Education Grant. It's actually targeted at city colleges, at community colleges, but we're the PI on it at UCSF because it's about training faculty at city colleges and training mentors at big research universities. And so we were able to sort of figure out how to work with a sub-awardee, which was the city college, to try to put together that program. And there's not actually a career development, like an explicit career development component to it. So you wouldn't think a career office would show up there, but we've been able to make that work. So that's multi-institutional. I think my answer to the question is more familiarity with the sub-award process where we get involved in pieces of it. And that's also a pretty easy way to get started with grant writing, is piggyback on somebody else's project as a sub-awardee. And this is maybe just sort of riffing again, but the talking to the program officer piece, I think as I was writing notes here, that was my _1 piece of advice, is never get too far down the process of writing your grant without talking to a program officer and bouncing the ideas around. Their interest is in getting the best proposals funded for their program. That's how they're measured. So they're often way more helpful than you would expect if you start bouncing ideas around with them before you get too far down the process. And having been a reviewer on one like big project or one big multi-institutional project grant, people write grants that aren't like even remotely responsive to the call for proposals. And you look at the grant proposal and you're like, people spent, you know, a couple hundred hours, you know, with a grant writing team or even more, putting together this 100-page grant proposal, and you know, it doesn't meet the funding requirements. And then you hear from the program officer that those folks that wrote that grant never actually touched base with them, and you're like, oh, what a waste of time. So don't do that. Talk to your program officers. They're there to help you. And then I got us off track, sorry.
I think that was a great point. Program officers, talk to them 100%.
Yeah. I see Amy's question. For myself, Amy's question is, do we pay our salaries from grants? It's actually a really good question because nobody in my units are required to, but this kind of ties with some earlier questions. I think maybe Teresa Dillinger asked, do we have people in our office to support the post-award accounting process? And after we started writing grants and everybody's like, oh, that's cool, you're getting in money, we actually had a pretty serious conversation with our business office and my boss's business office, basically, who said, you know, it's great that you're bringing in this money, but it's a pretty big burden to track the accounting process, accounting on it, even if it's a national, you know, a federal grant, and we're working with our Office of Sponsored Research post-award team, it's still a burden on us. And when the overhead, you know, the indirect cost of the grant, indirect funds provided by the grant are small, we don't get anything back from that. And so you're actually creating a lot of work on us. So congratulations on getting grants, and can you find a way to get it paid for so that we can get some money out of it as well? And so what we've kind of worked out is that as often as possible, we've tried to build even a small amount of our staff time salaries into those. So we're not required to pay for our salaries, but we're encouraged by our business office to say, if you're writing a $50,000 proposal, can you pay for $10,000 of your salary from it so that there's some benefit to our unit and not just all paying for the program?
Yeah, I'll echo that. I think similarly for us, it allows us to have more flexibility with other parts of our budget when we can cover parts of our salaries. And it also kind of justifies us spending time on that particular project. So it's kind of a dual purpose benefit. But like, for instance, travel, we had kind of limited travel budget until we had grant funds. And then we already wrote them into the grant, so we didn't have to have the discussion about it because it says you will attend this meeting and present at it. And so, you know, writing in like GCC, AAMC greats, TWD, whatever the important conferences are in your kind of sphere for your office can be a really good way to manage those type of extraneous things. If there's professional development, you can write that into your grants. If there's certifications or things you've wanted to do that will help advance your career, that's a great way to advocate for those. And then, you know, if there are programmatic things that you couldn't do without the grant, right, you can write those into the grant. But to the flip side of that, I think to Bill's point, using staff time and doing some of this other stuff sometimes does free you up to be able to ask for other things that you couldn't have done otherwise. And so there's a couple of different routes you can go by that.
As we're nearing the top of the hour, thanks again, and a big round of virtual applause to all of our panelists. Thank you, Becca, Bill, and Kim, for your time today and for imparting your wisdom and tips on navigating the grant process, particularly from our role as GCC members, as folks who might be coming both from the faculty side, but also from the program administrator side. And just as a reminder, a quick plug for our October 5th webinar on navigating the grant landscapes, part 3. It's a Zoom webinar on October 5th, same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, where we'll hear from the perspective of funding agencies and great points too toward the end of the conversation as a segue into that final sector of our grants workshop, our grant webinar workshops. So thank you again. You all take care and stay safe, and hope to see you at another GCC event Watch to your emails for a call on the GCC forum listservs about our October 5th grants webinar. Yeah, thanks y'all. Bye y'all. Take care.